Thank you very much, and yeah, a warm welcome to a more or less philosophical topic. The reflection about in what relation we can see architecture, software architecture, and self-organizations. And as there is another talk that might be also interesting, I offer you a chance to leave the room and say, I attended both talks, I provide you a too long didn't listen. So what are the main takeaways that you can get from this talk that I offer you now? Is the first insight is that, well, when we talk about self-organization, we talk about the natural state of the universe. There's nothing that we can introduce somewhere, it's just happening. When we talk about self-organization in social systems, we see that social systems tend to create structures that regulate self-organization, which is somehow paradoxical if you think about it a little deeper. What's quite interesting is that when you work in software development teams, and persons demand to introduce self-organization into a team, the person that demands the introduction of self-organization into a development team usually does not want self-organization. This person wants usually something else, and yeah, I will discover what this is in a few minutes. When we look on architectures, and it doesn't matter if we talk about architectures from buildings or from software systems. Architecture is the ultimate expression of the absence of self-organization. Where an architecture is, self-organization is limited in a very, very strong way. And yeah, the essence of a reflection about software architecture and self-organization and their relationship can be that the challenges that we have to face in the next years, in the next decades, that we need to solve with software architectures, they cannot be tackled by focusing on ideas like self-organization. We have to think about other aspects, other things. Upfront, a little disclaimer. I don't tell you any truth. There are other people in the world who yeah, have the privilege to tell the truth. I just share some models with you, how to think about certain aspects and how you can see some perspectives or find some perspectives in the way that, or in the aspects that we are talking about. The next important thing is that you might experience some ambiguity when I talk about software architecture and self-organization. That might come because I use terms, I use words, definitions that have other meanings in other contexts. So if there's something unclear and I don't provide a good understandable explanation of what I'm trying to say, just ask a question, use a chance, and we can clarify that. And last but not least, I have only around about 30 minutes, so I simplify things. I don't simplify so much that it becomes wrong, but I'm aware of keeping or using some shortcuts in a talk like this. So I'm aware of that. Please keep that in mind too. And yeah, then we can begin. I'm in the software industry. If I count the years that I spent after school in the computer shop, since 30 years now. And I see the term of self-organization since around about 25 years. And there are some waves. Sometimes there are years where this is more important for the people. There are years that when it becomes less important. But more or less, self-organization is something that is around me since I work as a paid software developer and architect in teams. And more or less the oldest reference from the software industry that I was able to find is the reference to self-organization in the Agile Manifesto. You maybe all know this, one of the 12 principles behind the Agile Manifesto. The best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. I use this slide in so many talks. And many people simply agree on that because it sounds so logical. And many of you maybe worked as developers in teams and came to the conclusion or experienced a situation where you maybe thought, well, a little less management, a little more responsibility on the side of the team would be quite good. But this is not what self-organization means. This is not the core concept of what happens when self-organization is happening. When you think about this sentence, this statement, this principle, we can slightly agree on that. And when I go back into to some years ago into my sociological lectures about system theory and what self-organization means and what this all results in, I can say, well, yes, from the perspective of a sociologist, this is true. The best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing team. But from the perspective of a sociologist, I have to tell you, well, so do the worst architectures. It's quite interesting that whenever we see a social system, a software development team or something like that, self-organization is always happening there. Self-organization is always going on there. We cannot have human interaction without a certain degree of self-organization. That will simply not happen. It's quite interesting that when you see an architecture, software architecture somewhere, you cannot conclude that this architecture is the result of self-organization or not. This way is simply not possible. So it's not, you cannot see retrospectively what was the amount of self-organization that led to a certain software architecture. From the perspective of a sociologist, I would say, well, self-organization is happening anyway. And what we can say is when we have an architecture that we define as good or maybe as the best architecture, the self-organization is neither necessary nor sufficient to create that best architecture. And I try to give you an idea of why that is so. In the Too Long Didn't Listen, I already said that self-organization is the natural state of the universe. And when you look and search for how is self-organization defined, you will find definitions like that self-organization is a process of elements creating structures from disorder in a way where they interact local with each other. That is the core concept of self-organization. This is how galaxies are formed in the universe. This is how planets evolve, how the sun evolved, and so on. So you can see the concept of self-organization in very in a huge amount in very many natural processes, natural situations. It's quite interesting that the same thing that led to the existence of planets, galaxies in the universe, happens when human beings interact with each other. We can see exactly the same patterns happen. When we see human beings as element of a certain system, and you move some people together in a certain area, you see that things will happen. People start interacting with each other. People start to create structures. The interesting thing and the misunderstanding of self-organization in social systems and in, for example, the universe is that they both follow exactly the same pattern, and for self-organization is one thing not necessary, a common goal. When we talk about software teams, we often see the idea, and we often talk about the idea, give the team a goal and let them self-organize and everything will be fine and so on. This is not how it works. When you want to experience self-organization, you can use, for example, an hourglass. When you turn such an hourglass, you see the process of self-organization in a very fundamental way. The sand rushes through the hourglass, and somehow on the bottom of the hourglass, the grains of sand find a structure and fall down to a certain position. The essence of that kind of self-organization is that there is no goal, and there is no person who tells no master grain of sand or no lord grain of sand who tells the other grains, well, you go there and you go there. It's just happening, and it forms a structure. The structure is exactly what is in the sand on the bottom of the hourglass. It will always look a little bit different, but it forms some kind of a structure. The interesting thing is exactly that happens when we see self-organization in social systems. And the paradoxical thing is that as soon as we gave a goal to a social system, we enforce the interactions and the resulting self-organization into a certain direction. That is why whenever we have some endeavor of human interactions that create something by intent, we always limit the possibilities of self-organization. So we build organizations not to introduce self-organization, but to guarantee a certain outcome out of the interactions that happen in the social system. When we want to build pyramids, we need to give the people who are involved a certain goal. We need to have an idea, we need to share it, and we need to enforce the interactions in the social system of all people who are involved in the process of building such a pyramid to directly or to direct in the direction of the goal that we have announced. So whenever we try to do something together, whenever we try to reach a goal together, we need to reduce the amount of self-organization. And you can experience that in a lot of situations. Besides architecture. One is, you can see a lot of self-organization when you, for example, go to Berlin main station. Just go to some of the platforms and watch how people are running and rushing through the main station. This is quite a good example of self-organization. You see some interactions between them. They move out of the way of each other so that they mostly do not hinder each other. Sometimes, they have to say, pardon me, if that didn't work. But mostly you have people who follow individual goals, who have no common goal, and you see interactions just in a way that, I move out of the way of others so that they can follow their path. The situation changed dramatically when the person arrives at the platform where they start waiting for their train. Then structures form. You can see the structures in the moment when the train arrives and the people move through to the doors. It's always chaotic in Germany. You can see these structures when the train comes a little late. This is something you can practice quite well in Germany. And the people are looking on their watches and on their smartphone, when will the train arrive and how long do we need to wait. These are structures that emerge out of the disorder that happens on the whole main station. And when we think about software systems, we need to take this idea of self-organization and keep it in mind and think about how can self-organization be helpful and when is it hindering us in creating architectures. And to discuss that, I would like to look onto where architecture comes from, I would like to look on buildings, real buildings. Sorry, I'm a terrible photographer, I know that, but I have some pictures from my last trip to Vienna, because in Vienna you have very many beautiful buildings which you can use for talking about architecture. I'm sure you all love definitions, and there are some definitions about software architecture that would also match quite well onto the architecture of houses, of buildings. Yeah, the ISO 42010 says software architecture is a fundamental organization of a system embodied in its components, their relationships to each other, and to their environment and principles guiding its design and evolution. It's just one of the many definitions of software architecture that you can find. And what's quite interesting is that if we don't focus on software architecture, you can also apply this definition to the architecture of buildings. Houses, buildings like that also follow a certain, consist of components. They are structured in a certain way. These components are in a certain relation to each other and so on. For example, windows usually go to the outside. You have usually a door as a main entrance and doors between the rooms in the house. So you have different components, for example, the rooms that are connected to each other with doors. You would be surprised if you go into a house and see the doors going outside and windows are just between the rooms in the house. That would be somehow strange, maybe. The interesting thing is that when we look onto such an architecture and think about self-organization, this architecture limits the possibilities of self-organization in two ways. The first way is it limits the possibilities of self-organization for the people who build, who create this building, this structure. It enforces consistency. All the windows in every floor are from the same type. So as a manufacturer of windows, it's quite simple for me to provide matching windows in a economical, sufficient, and capable way. Things like this, ideas like this, reduce the self-organization between the parties that are involved in creating the architecture. So when we have an idea of an architecture, the structure that we have as an idea already limits the possibilities of self-organization. The second thing that we do with an architecture, the second point where we limit the self-organization, is when the architecture is there. Within the architecture, within the building, you have certain limitations, certain boundaries that you cannot cross. When you are the electrician company or something like that, that try to build the cables in such a building, you are limited by the walls that are in place. So these walls, these boundaries, are limits for your possible interactions that you can have with other parties that are involved in building the architecture, with other parties that work on the architecture, and with parties that use the architecture later on. So architecture, in that way, be it a building or be it software, limits the possibilities of self-organization. On the other side, 2 streets far from the building that I showed you on the last photo, there's a building like that. It's one of the Hundertwasser buildings. You maybe have seen the houses in that style, and it's quite, on the first side, it's quite different. You will find no 2 windows in that building that are from the same type. You will not find 2 rooms with the same layout in that building. But still, that is architecture. From the outside, from the idea of thinking about self-organization, individuality, and stuff like that, you can say, well, this is much more individual. It has a higher amount of, or tolerates a higher amount of self-organization than the other one, but that's not how it really works. You see, a completely different building, completely different structures. We don't see any consistency in that building when we look from the outside into that building compared to the other one. But the principles that led to this kind of architecture, to this kind of building, are very different from the principles that led to the consistent building, to the consistent architecture. But what you can still experience is there are patterns below that principles that are identical in both architectures. For example, windows go to the outside. There is a door for having an entrance. So we will find a lot of very small patterns, even in a Hundertwasserhaus, that follow the same principles or follow the same rules and that restrict us in our self-organization in the same way as they do when we build an ordinary house with a consistent architecture. So the architecture itself becomes a rule, and this rule governs the self-organization that is possible in building the house and in later on maintaining it or living in it. So it's quite a good question to discuss which architectural style can tolerate more self-organization during the building process and which is not so capable of tolerating self-organization. When you think, well, from perspective from the outside, I might see that the Hundertwasserhaus on the left side is more a result of a self-organized process. And the building on the right side doesn't tolerate so much because we have visible consistency rules. It's quite interesting to look onto such results from a sociological perspective. It depends whether the building on the left and the right are created by intent or not. If the Hundertwasserhaus was created accidentally, which could possibly happen, then I would say, well, yeah, there was underlying a lot of self-organization that happened and led to this result. A building like this one on the right side is usually not possible with a too high degree of self-organization, but when the building is created, when the architecture emerges out of nothing, during this process you can tolerate a certain amount of self-organization. It's quite interesting that when you want to create something with a very low degree of consistency, you need to lower the amount of self-organization much stronger or much more than when you want to create an architecture that is consistent. The reason behind that is, on the right side, in a consistent architecture, you have communicatable rules. And these rules limit your possibilities for self-organization. They steer the interactions in the system that creates the architecture, but still there is room for it. On the left side, when you want to create a building like that, when you want to create an architecture like that with a very low level of consistency, you need a lot of guided interactions that enforce the shared goal, because you cannot generalize rules. It's simply not possible. So the more individual an architecture becomes by intent, the more you need to lower the amount of self-organization that happens in the social system that creates the architecture. So when we say the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams, I would say now, no. It's not the self-organization that leads to the best architecture. It's something else. So what is the difference that makes a difference? What is the ability of teams to create really good architectures? And I would say when we look on teams who create architectures that are very resilient, that are very maintainable over a long term, that are sustainable, I would say that these kind of architectures emerge from teams who have the ability to define rules rules that create appropriate structures from disorder, from the self-organization that happens in the team. And whenever a person demands self-organization in a software development team, I usually use this hourglass model and ask, you want to be a grain of sand? And usually the people say, no, I don't want to be a grain of sand. And when I ask and dig a little deeper into why does this person usually wants self-organization, I experience it mostly as a situation of overconfidence. The most situations that I met in projects where people demanded self-organizations were the result of having an opinion that was rejected. And the idea is, if there would be self-organization, the system must automatically come to the same conclusion that I have, because mine is the right one. Try it out when you experience that in your software development teams. People ask for self-organization. People say, we must have a higher degree of self-organization. We must introduce self-organization in the team. Try it out. What is really behind that demand? What is really the reason for that? So when you think about software architecture and self-organization in that way, and say, well, it's not the self-organization, it's creating rules and creating structures from disorder, what we need to train teams. We can ask what's next. And I would say the first thing that the software industry must learn is to stop obsessing about itself and team structures and all this cultural firlefanz. We need to focus on some other things. And what are these other things? In my point of view, these are architectural principles. We need to think about some fundamental principles that help us to create architectures that may survive the challenges in the next years and decades. And I have 3 principles identified. They are more from the perspective of a sociologist and less from the perspective of an architect, but maybe they are helpful and give you some ideas to discuss or to talk about. And the first principle that I would ask for is the principle of responsibility, so that we support teams, that we enforce teams to build architectures in a way that these teams are aware of the consequences that they produce with their architectural decisions. Consequences in ways of security, in ways of sustainability, in ways of talking about, do we really need to burn the power of the amount of energy that a city like Berlin uses in a day just to answer a question on ChatGPT or something like that. So some green aspects are also aspects that we might have in mind when we think about consequences. So the first principle I would advocate for is a principle of responsibility. The second principle is, from my point of view, a principle of empowerment. We should build architectures, software architectures that empower especially the non-technical users to take control over their use of technology. There are some movements around that support actions like that. For example, movements like iFixit and so on that support people in repairing stuff in the hardware way. We can also adapt such ideas to the software world. I'm quite sure we have the technology today that enforces us as software developers to lower our perspective or our self-understanding as technical wizards and become more grounded, like the dwarves in the fantasy role-playing games, very close to earth. So Schiller once said that simplicity is the expression of maturity, and I would advocate in the sense of Schiller that when we build architectures, we need to become a little more mature to create more simplicity and to empower people who are non-technical users to work with our systems. The third principle I would advocate for, and this is the last one, is the principle of agency. We can learn one thing from self-organized system, and the one thing that is really, really of value that happens in self-organized system is the ability of having local interactions that are not governed or controlled by a major instance somewhere, and to create structures out of these local interactions that are capable of really of bearing a lot of environmental stress. These kind of architectures can maybe become architectures that are more sustainable in a way that we can adopt much easier to stressors like what's happening actually on the planet with all the cloud movements who are owned by at the moment in the majority American companies, which are quite a threat for Europe at the moment. We can think about this agency as a concept of maintainability, because when we have local interactions in software systems, the way or the possibilities of maintaining such systems increase a lot because we can solve problems better local. And yeah, it would also help us in ways to think about security, because it might be easier to have data just local and to distribute maybe only results of calculations and not the amount of the content of whole databases. So we can think about this concept, the sociological concept of agency, in a very broad way when we try to adopt it to software architecture. And these three principles are just an idea that might be helpful to discuss about how self-organization and architecture can coexist. Then self-organization is always there. We cannot introduce it. We can just influence it in a way of limiting it or steering it towards a certain direction. And architecture, when we create it, is the boundary and the path that limits and directs self-organization towards a certain goal, towards a certain structure that we intend to create and to build. And that's the main message. And thank you for listening. And if you have some questions, yeah, just ask.
All right. Thank you very much, Gerrit. So far, there are no questions in Slido, but maybe, just maybe, there is a question in the audience. Yeah, there is one.
Yeah, that's much easier than typing. Your principles in order to apply them successfully in teams, do you believe that teams need to share values, or are they a set of values already that you're proposing? What role do you see for organizational or other values that people bring into the teams?
Yeah, the question of values, that's quite a hard topic. I really don't see any value in discussing about values. Nobody is able to describe that as a concept that make people able to act in a certain direction. So it's quite a good concept of creating some consultant work, but it's usually nothing that really helps people in acting in a certain direction. So from my point of view, I would not focus on values, but I would say we need to support people in taking the best possible outcome out of their interactions that they have, and this is something that I would not force into the more or less esoteric discussion of values and such stuff. I'm too much in sociology to believe in values anymore. So I hope that's an answer you can live with.
Right. There's another question over there. Wait a minute.
Yeah, in the quote of the manifest, it says teams, so self-organized teams, and then you compared it with people in a train station, which are known teams, and also the other thing there I questioned was there are still rules, right? So in a train station you can't just work on the train, so you have to follow the rules. So that was what I was thinking a bit about, if this is how you can compare it.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. The problem is we live on a planet where there are many rules. So every self-organization that we experience in a social system are always guided by some certain rules, being it cultural rules that we say Guten Tag when we arrive somewhere or something like that. So the essential self-organization that we experience when we talk about the evolution of the universe or these sand grains in the hourglass, we cannot experience in social systems anymore. We share things like languages, which are also kinds of rules that force us into certain kind of interactions. So I would say there is no true, universal self-organization in a team possible. It's always a limited amount, and usually teams are parts of organization, and the organization has the capability of declaring the team to no longer exist. That is out of everything that you can describe with self-organization in any way. So there are always limits, and we have to live with it, and that's why it's quite. From my point of view, it's a simplification, but it's quite okay to say we can see the same kinds, the same patterns of self-organization in a software development team and compare it to some kinds of patterns that we see on, for example, the Berlin main station, I would say. So, but it's a simplification, of course. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I like your principles a lot. The second one, I think it was when you said something about like, especially non-technical people, exactly, they can take control over their use of technology. Yeah. What's really interesting is, like, this sounds like a holy grail, haha, and you know, but there is a lot of things underneath that you basically accomplish. And there's, in technical conversations, for example, I tell my folks, build your architectures in a way that the system can be tested. Yeah. And just by building things in a way they can be tested, suddenly there has to be some kind of architecture, right? And this is what those principles fundamentally unlock, right? We don't have to agree on the second line of it, right? But basically just at least anchoring, going somewhat into this direction, many, many positive things can happen. And this is less of a question, but rather just like, I really like this a lot. Build towards testability, you will end up in something that is so much better than not building towards testability. Building towards empowerment, you end up with something that is so much better in terms of like being structured, being, you know, maintainable, being obvious, right? Than not going this direction. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I fully agree. All right, so please, reminder, I'm opening the feedback for the session now. Please provide feedback, and let's close this off with a big round of applause for Gerrit.
Thank you.